So far, this is my favorite episode of House of the Dragon. From the immaculate detail of the funeral scene with so many character interactions, the hot debate between Corlys and Rhaenys about legacy and the risk of pursuing it, the pure scale of Vhagar and the adrenaline-inducing flight, Daemon and Rhaenyra finally getting together, the explosive family confrontation, and the twist ending with Laenor. This episode is flat out stacked with great scenes. Before going into all that, there are only a few minor flaws that bugged me a bit that I'll address now before going into the outstanding positives. The pace between episodes is still too fast, and that's mainly in regards to Rhaenyra moving on instantly from Sir Harwin Strong. It seemed like she was in love with the man, and the second she hears word of his death, she immediately turns around and marries Daemon. I wish we had a bit of a moment for them to mourn their father getting killed, but it makes sense because they can't publicly mourn the Strongs, because that essentially validates the rumors about her kids. But they could have given us a scene of them doing that in private, and also the kids coming to terms with their false identity. Like, that would have been a great scene, but since the show is moving so fast, we didn't get to see that. Then another thing that bothered me in this episode was the lighting and color grade of some of the night scenes. As an example, in this particular shot, you can clearly tell it's daytime since you can see the shadows casted from the sun. They are giving the footage a cooler temperature and turning down the exposure to make it seem like it's almost nighttime. That fake nighttime aesthetic bothers me, but since most of the episode is supposed to take place at night, I can't really fault the episode that much. I've seen people compare this to The Long Night since both episodes are directed by Miguel Sapochnik, but come on. One is definitely a lot darker than the other. It just sucks that some important dialogue takes place in darkness, like Rhaenyra and Daemon's talk on the beach. Which, going into that, there's one more and final issue I have, is that Rhaenyra explains to Daemon her relationship with Sir Harwin. I wish we actually got to see that relationship instead of skipping over it and then just explaining it. It is nice for the writers to acknowledge it here, but due to the scene being at night, we can barely see her expressions at times, and the sadness that she portrays is kind of lost because of that. However, them both explaining their own perspectives the night they went out with each other was very cathartic because that moment between them was kind of a question mark. Then that leads into the romantic sex scene. I don't know if this moment is upsetting anyone, but come on. This wouldn't be a Game of Thrones worthy follow-up if we didn't have any incest right after a funeral. Looking at the funeral scene, I still don't know how people can call this show dull by any means. The pure efficiency and storytelling of just characters looking at each other speaks so many volumes. Like Vaemond delivering his funeral eulogy, and when he starts to talk about Valyrian blood, he is staring directly at Rhaenyra and her children with disdain. That immediately tells us there is tension there, and he knows that they aren't true Valyrians. And then this continues with her realizing that and getting uncomfortable, Viserys then briefly noticing, and then Daemon capping off this whole moment by laughing at that fact. What otherwise would be a stereotypical eulogy speech where Vaemond would be staring off into the distance, the writers multitask and establish an upcoming conflict, which is the illegitimacy of Rhaenyra's children. So there's nothing here to really make you bored, and Ramin Djawadi's score is absolutely beautiful too. I love to play some of it, but yeah, copyright yada yada. For the post-funeral scene, there's one aspect here that I particularly love, and that's the cinematography. The shallow focus gives the scene a lot of depth, because as the camera rack focuses through the crowd, it reveals to us different characters staring at each other with varying expressions. It's basically like knocking out 2 to 3 birds with one stone in a single shot, because we are constantly seeing so many perspectives and reactions from different characters. Because of this, the scene is very engaging despite it not having a ton of dialogue. And even then, the dialogue between some of the characters like Aegon and his siblings and Daemon and Viserys were really good, especially when Aegon was making a joke about not wanting to marry his sister and just in general being an absolute menace. There's also a few moments where the lack of dialogue is key. Like when Rhaenys walks past Rhaenyra and they don't say anything to each other, essentially implying that they still heavily dislike one another, and Rhaenys probably knowing about the kids. I also like the subtle moment before this where some random lord gives their condolences to Rhaenys, but Rhaenyra doesn't in comparison. It further makes this moment even more awkward. I can go on for a while about how much I like each and every small and subtle moment, but we'd be here for quite some time. To me, it's a testament to how good the writing is and how the writers don't overly rely on explaining things to the audience. That's why a lot of these performances are so captivating, because the audience relies more on watching their acting instead of relying on the dialogue. And before moving on, it's also Pog AF that Otto Hightower is the Hand again. After the funeral, we then go right into a banger of a dialogue scene between Rhaenys and Corlys. I think the validation to how good the scene is comes from the fact that the people editing the trailers for this show pulled 2 quotes from the scene.
What is this brief mortal life, if not the pursuit of legacy? History does not remember blood. It remembers names.
I really love the pairing between Corlys and Rhaenys because the internal conflict between them is massive. Rhaenys' compassion for her children makes her put their health and safety over everything, while Corlys is more obsessed with power and legacy, that he is blindsided by that and compromises the safety of his family. They both offer great counterpoints in this scene, and it makes both of them seem convincing and compelling. Rhaenys in particular comes across as very smart and observant, and her taking off the ignorant blinds covering Corlys' eyes in regards to Rhaenyra's children not being Velaryons was a good example of this. Even the irony of Rhaenys not wanting power despite being robbed of it makes this dynamic even more interesting. Then I also love the cinematography of these types of scenes where they are contrasted by a warm fire. Makes any profile close-ups of the actors really pop because of the highlights from the bright light source. Looking at the scene where Aemond tames and flies Vhagar, it literally blew me away. Like, honestly, I wasn't expecting it to be as crazy as it was, but the pure scale of Vhagar was insane. I know we saw her, or him? I think it's her, in the episode prior, but it was very brief and it was kind of hard to grasp the true magnitude of her scale. But here, Jesus, this dragon is a massive chungus. Despite the scene being in darkness, I think they still did a good job showing her size in comparison to the environment. And it's also not too dark to the point of where you can't see anything. Like, the fact that Aemond is basically climbing up a tower to get onto the dragon was awesome. And the big wide shot to see Vhagar's full wingspan was awe-inspiring. I couldn't not think of how to train your dragon in this scene. I think this was a great iteration of it. I'm really happy that HBO spared no expense here because this was probably a very expensive scene despite there not being any major action or battles. This also makes me think back to Game of Thrones where Daenerys was just hanging on to the thorny scales of Drogon's back, and honestly, that seems so unrealistic in comparison now. How did she get enough grip strength to not get blasted off the dragon from the sheer amount of wind? Like, I love how they showed how much of a struggle it was to stay on Vhagar's back, and it really made the scene much more suspenseful. So when Aemond finally learned how to control the dragon, it made it much more satisfying. I can't imagine what future battle scenes will look like with all these dragons because, ironically, it will probably be significantly more epic than the final major battle of the Long Night, which isn't a hard bar to clear, but still, it was supposed to be the biggest battle. Moving on to the first climactic showdown between the Greens and the Blacks, this scene was utterly riveting throughout. I love the awkward silence in so many moments because everyone knows the truth of Rhaenyra's children, but no one wants to admit it. It's like a weight that's crushing everyone. So when Viserys is desperately trying to hold everything together, it makes his attempts seem futile because this inherent conflict is inevitable. This build-up to me has perfect tension because we don't know if Aemond is going to rat out Alicent, since they are questioning as to where he learned the rumors regarding Rhaenyra's children. The writers did a great job in drawing this out, and then Aegon eventually just spilling the beans was oddly cathartic and in character. Then the scene harkens back to Cersei demanding equal punishment in season 1, where she had the direwolf killed, so you eagerly wait and see if Viserys is infected by Alicent's persuasion. Only for it to not be, and the sudden twist of her rushing the child with the blade made for an outstanding climax. To me, this scene is essentially perfect. On one hand, you have a masterclass in buildup of suspense, and then a quick turn to an explosive ending. This is what peak Game of Thrones is, as this whole conflict is imbued with an engaging political shitstorm that is barreling towards a major reckoning. And the crazy thing is that this is just a small taste as of what is to come. So the fact that the precursor to the Dance of the Dragons, which is supposed to be the main event, is still pretty good is impressive. Then surprisingly, the episode doesn't even end here, and they move on to the fake-out death of Laenor Velaryon. I thought the episode was going to end with Rhaenyra and Daemon saying they were going to kill Laenor, but nope, the episode just keeps on going and getting better. I love the twist the writers did with him not actually dying and then making the audience think he burnt to a crisp. I was just starting to really sympathize with Rhaenyra, and if she killed her husband after he recommitted himself, then I would have been pretty upset with her. But the twist immediately redeems her, and it's nice to see at least one character in this universe get a happy ending. But now that Daemon and Rhaenyra are together, it makes me very excited for the future of the show. Their power dynamic is going to be so infectious, and I'm 100% ready for it. Like, honestly, I feel so satisfied to the point of where this could have been the season finale, and I would have accepted that. If they didn't do any major time jumps and give us more episodes, thus making the season 1 endpoint here, then that would have been pretty solid. But people were clamoring to get to the Civil War and are saying the show is boring, so whatever. Some other noteworthy scenes and moments is the fight between the children, where I thought Aemond was actually going to kill one of Rhaenyra's kids. Otto Hightower again lurking in the shadows like Littlefinger, Laenor Strong creeping around in the background, and Otto Hightower finally admiring his daughter. There really isn't a bad scene in this episode, and the only flaw I can attribute to it is the pacing. But that's more of an overall season issue. Thank you for watching, and let me know what you thought about episode 7 of House of the Dragon.